Hello friends, today I'll tell you the story in which it's really hard to believe. So, let's start. This story took place in Sierra Madre Oriental. There lies a series of caves and they are situated several small villages. They are very isolated and they are populated primarily with illiterate poor farmers. One night in May 1963, a 14-year-old boy, Sebastian Guerrero, who lived in one of these small isolated villages, he decided to go for a walk in the mountains. He wanted to explore different caves. For centuries, there were rumors of gold buried in the Sierra Madre Mountains, hidden in one of the hundreds of caves around the area. Maybe he was looking for them, so he starts walking up the mountains towards the first entrance. He can see that it's really dark and nothing special, nothing interesting there. So he's got no flashlight, he's just walking up, and as he walking, he noticed the light. It was coming out of one of the cave entrances, and he had never recalled seeing light coming from one of any of these caves, and nobody ever went in this case, and especially not at night. So it was very interesting for him what was happening there, and drawn by the lights and noises coming from that cave, he went to investigate. It sounds like a person, either they are laughing or they are screaming. He doesn't really know. He's thinking maybe someone having a party inside of these caves. He has no idea, but after he gets maybe 200 or 300 feet away from this entrance, he realizes that it's definitely a person and maybe a group of people, and they are definitely screaming, and it doesn't sound like they are screaming out of joy. It sounds like they are screaming because they are scared or they are in pain. And as he getting closer and closer and closer to this cave, his anxiety is starting to ramp up, and because he's really starting to be very frightened by what he's hearing. So he realized that there is a group of people and they are doing something, and there is one person or several that are screaming, and so he's starting to get nervous about this cave, and he plopped down behind a rock, and so he isn't really sure if it's a good idea to look. He doesn't want to be spotted by whoever. He takes a deep breath and he looks inside, and what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror, and then he starts running down the mountain away from this cave. Terrified, he ran for more than 25 kilometers to the town of Villagran, where the nearest police station was located. Exhausted and in a state of shock, he failed to give any other description than seeing a group of murderers seized by ecstasy gathered to drink a human blood. His claims were met with ridiculous by the officers, who took them as delusions of a mentally ill or drugged boy. So Sebastian, he was really frustrated, and he was kind of pleading, please, to believe him, like no, you got to take me seriously. There is something bad happening in this cave. Someone could be hurt, someone could be dying, and he doesn't know, but probably you need to check what is going there in this cave. But the police, at this point, they are just really not interested in this situation with this cave, and they just drive him back to his village. And so he goes back into his home. The police go back to their station, and everyone just goes to bed for the night. The next day, when Sebastian wakes up, he would once again run back to the police station, and when he got there, he began pleading with the police like, you really need and go see what's inside of this cave. And he's really telling them that there is something really awful and strange. And one investigator, Luis Martinez, he would say that, okay, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. And so they left the police station with the police car, and later the other police officers who weren't really paying attention to this cave, they realized that Luis and the boy hadn't returned yet, and that Luis, he hadn't checked in via his radio. And the other officers, they began calling out to Luis. They began calling him on his radio and trying to figure out what's going on. He wasn't responding, and they thought that probably he will be back. By the evening, the other officers, they were concerned that something bad happened to their colleague and the boy. So they tried calling him Luis a few more times on the radio. And they arrived to the village and talked with Sebastian's family. And they would say that he hasn't back yet and they are missing. And so the police, at this point, they realize that this is an emergency and that they need to figure out where these two went. So, despite by the disappearance of boss, Guerrero and their colleague, the police started to take the case seriously and contacted the army for assistance. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. To understand what was found inside, we need to go back in late 1962 and early 1963. Brothers Santos and Caetano Hernandez, who made their living basically traveling around Mexico and stealing from people, they once created a very interesting plan. Their plan was to go into a small, fairly isolated village that was populated primarily with poor and illiterate people, and they would go and they would convince the villagers that they were actually prophet of an exiled Incan god. And if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. The village the brothers identified as their target was a place called La Yerba Buena, which was located right at the foot of Sierra Madre Oriental, right below where the cave was that Luis and Sebastian went to investigate. And La Yerba Buena was exactly what the brothers were looking for. It was home to only about 20 families that were all very poor and illiterate, and they were very suggestible. They put on very dramatic show explaining how they were the prophets of the sink and God. And these two brothers, they were really excellent salesmen, and so they really sold the lie. And these villagers who were really very vulnerable and cut off from the rest of the world, they just believed these brothers, and they thought that they are going to be rich. They were told that Incan gods, in return for worship and tribute, would give them treasures hidden in the caves of the mountains surrounding the villages, and would soon come to claim authority over their former kingdom and punish the unbelievers. So villagers, they would give brothers anything they wanted and do anything they wanted. But after a couple of months, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with Hernandez brothers. The cult continued running like that with no problem for a while, after which the believers began to grow impatient at not seeing the promises fulfilled. So the brothers devised a plan. They went to Monterrey in search of prostitutes who wanted to be part of the farce, and made contact with Magdalena and her brother, who agreed to participate. She was a prostitute, and they tell her that, we have this con we're doing in La Yerba Buena, where we are like gods. We are pretending to be prophet of Incan God, and they are starting not to believe our lie. And so we need you. And if you're willing to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess, then you're in. And when you show up, they will know that we were serious, that we have a direct line, and that we have the direct line to the Incan gods and goddess, and they will believe us again, and they will fall back in line. And so she likes the idea of participating in this, and so she agrees to do it in exchange for some money. They dressed her up in an Incan goddess costume, and brothers, they went back down to the village, and they rounded up villagers, and they said them that, come on, let's go up to the cave. We have a special ceremony for you. During a ritual, they presented, using a cheap magic trip, a smoke screen, Solis as the reincarnation of a goddess. She said, villagers, that if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you. And so the message she was sending to the villagers was so intense, they completely believed that this was an Incan goddess. And however, there was an element of brothers' plan they couldn't possibly have accounted for, that this girl, she would believe in her lie. She literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess. Within a few weeks of being in La Yerba Buena, she was really abusing with every villager, and she was communicating with them in a really horrible way. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so she demanded all the villagers provide her with blood. In fear of retribution, the villagers, they began slaughtering all their farm animals and their own pets, so Magdalena could drink their blood for weeks and weeks and weeks. Finally, sometime in April, two of the villagers, they decided that, I've had enough, I don't believe her, and she isn't actually an Incan goddess, and that they don't believe brothers, and that they are actually prophets, and they think that it is all scam, and so they decided to run away. Brothers, they found out about it, and they in turn told Magdalena about it, and when she heard the news, she immediately told everyone in the village to make their way up to the cave for a special ceremony. So all the villagers, including two people that were planning on running away, they made their way up to the cave, and once everyone was inside, she walked to the front of the group and she pointed at these two people that were planning on running, and she demanded that the rest of the villagers, they are going to kill them. And on the spot, all of other villagers, they jumped on top of the two guys and they lynched them. They beat them to death and in the cave, and then after these two people have been killed, she orders their bodies be thrown up onto pikes, and she had set up in the back of the cave because she knew what she was going to be doing up in this cave. And so after these two bodies were thrown up on these spikes, she grabs a shells and she works over to these bodies and she presses them, and she presses the shells up against their bodies where they bleeding from, and she fills it up and then she drinks. Suddenly she understood that it wasn't good enough to just be drinking animal blood, that wasn't enough to keep her a goddess alive, and she now could only consume human blood. And so for the next several weeks, she from time to time would order everyone in the village to go back up to the cave for a blood ritual. And after these first two murders, as is characteristic of serial murders, their crimes evolved and becoming more violent. Bored with simple orgies, she began to demand human sacrifice. She devised a blood ritual. The sacrificed, which was always a dissenting member, was brutally beaten, burned, cut, and maimed by all the members of the cult. Thereafter, she practiced bloodletting, and the victim was made to bleed to death. The blood was deposited in a cup mixed with chicken blood. The ritual also included animal sacrifices and use of some substances as peyote and marijuana. And Solis, she drank from the chalice and then gave to drink to the brothers and her brother, and finally gave the other members. And presumably this gave them extra natural powers. And now, based on elements from Aztec mythology, the blood was the only decent food, and for the gods, through it they preserved their immortality. The goddess needed to drink blood to stay young forever. The butchering went out for 6 continuous weeks in 1963, and in a period in which 4 people died in this terrible way. And in the last sacrifice, they reached the point of dissect the heart of the victims alive. So in May of 1963, Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, and the police officer, Louise, they would go back to the cave, and this woman and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave. And both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. They would have their hearts cut out, and she would drink their blood. And when the police and army arrived in La Yerba Buena, it was a ghost town, because all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave, where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons. And because probably she knew there was going to be a big police response, because one of their officers has gone missing out here, and they are bound to be found out. And so when the police and the army reached the cave, there was a big shootout with all of the villagers, and during the shootouts, the majority of the villagers were killed. Also, the Hernandez brothers, they were also killed in the shootout. And then after the shootout stopped, the police and the army would go into this cave, and they would discover the pikes, the bloody pikes that are in the back of the cave, with the bits of human remains all over the ground. And then they would leave the cave and they would search the town, and they would finally found the remains of Louise and Sebastian outside a particular shack. And then inside the shack was Magdalena and her brother. They were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities, and finally they would be arrested, and they were sentenced to 50 years in prison. And all of the surviving villagers who participated in these sacrifices, or who participated in the shooting with police and the army, they were given 30 years in prison. Amazingly, but none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother, despite the fact they were almost certainly offered reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. They were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. Thank you for watching this episode, and see you the next time. Bye. Goodbye. Goodbye, my love. Goodbye. Oh, my love. Bye-bye. Bye.